The rain came down in sheets, cold and metallic, hissing as it hit the barrels stacked beside the hangar. Private Evan Holt rubbed his palms together, watching the storm blur the airfield into a gray smear. The war had turned him into a ghost, who listened more than he spoke. But that night, in late 1944, he heard something strange. A low mechanical whine, followed by a shrill hiss that rose and fell like a wounded animal. The ground trembled. Out of the mist rolled a weapon he'd never seen before. They called it the Vortex gun. It wasn't a gun in the way soldiers understood guns. It didn't fire bullets or shells. It fired air. Pressurized chambers and explosives were designed to send shockwaves strong enough to knock aircraft from the sky. German engineers claimed it could bring down bombers without a single round of ammunition. The prototype looked like a monstrous trumpet aimed at heaven. Holt stood beside the German prisoner who had been forced to help assemble it after capture. The man, thin and trembling, said in broken English, "They thought they could make thunder their weapon. But thunder doesn't obey orders." When the Vortex gun fired, the air screamed. A ripple of invisible force shot upward, tearing the clouds like cloth. The Allied observers watched, stunned, as a flock of birds fell lifeless, their fragile lungs crushed. The generals took notes, impressed. But the next test went wrong. The weapon recoiled, ripping its steel base apart, sending shards flying like knives. Holt dragged a screaming technician out from the wreckage. "It's madness," he muttered. "Killing with air." The strange machine was never used again, but rumors whispered it had worked once, and that was enough for men to keep chasing impossible weapons. Months later, Holt found himself in the ruins of Warsaw, now attached to an intelligence unit cataloging abandoned enemy projects. He stumbled upon crates marked Project Fledermaus, Project Bat. Inside were odd contraptions, delicate wings made of canvas and steel, small engines, and glass tubes filled with incendiary gel. A note, water-stained but legible, explained the plan. Bats trained to carry tiny firebombs. Thousands would be released over enemy cities at dawn. They would roost under roofs, in attics, and when the timers ignited, the whole city would burn. It sounded insane, but the Americans had tried it too. Bat bombs, they called them. Holt read the report and laughed once, dryly. Even the clever go mad in war. The irony stung. The project was abandoned after an accident. A few bats escaped during testing and burned down a hangar in New Mexico. Nature refused to be a soldier. But the strangest weapon Holt ever saw came not from a lab, but from the sea. Late 1944, off the coast of Norway, he met a British diver named Mason who spoke of something called the Panjandrum, a colossal, two-wheeled rocket-propelled drum meant to storm beaches and explode inland. The thing looked like a circus attraction more than a weapon. Twin wheels taller than a man, a steel drum packed with explosives, and dozens of rockets strapped along the rims. They thought it'd roll straight up the beach at Normandy, Mason said, with a grin that was half terror, half pride. Only problem, she never rolled straight. Last test it went berserk, nearly flattened the Admiral's car. Holt could almost see it. The monstrous wheel lurching across the sand, rockets sputtering, officers diving for cover as the machine veered like a drunken god. War made men dream absurd dreams, and sometimes those dreams grew engines and teeth. In 1945, as Berlin fell and Europe bled itself dry, Holt was sent to recover documents from a facility deep in the Black Forest. The air smelled of resin and smoke. Inside, among piles of papers and twisted machinery, he found what might have been the war's most secret invention. A wind cannon, or wind cannon, an enormous pipe system intended to shoot compressed air at Allied bombers flying low over bridges. The blueprints showed hopes of collapsing aircraft wings with shock waves. It had never worked. The materials couldn't handle the pressure. But what struck Holt most was the dedication. Thousands of man-hours spent on a dream of invisible destruction. They wanted to command the wind, he wrote in his journal. But the wind serves no master. As the war ended, Holt returned home carrying more ghosts than medals. Yet the memory of those strange machines haunted him. Each invention told a story, not just of science and desperation, but of imagination twisted by war. They were proof that when humans fight to survive, reason itself becomes another casualty. Years later, in a quiet museum in London, Holt stood before a glass case containing a small, rusted device no bigger than a loaf of bread. A Japanese kaiten, a manned torpedo. Inside, a young pilot would seal himself, guiding the weapon toward enemy ships. It was the ultimate sacrifice, the perfect embodiment of wartime obsession, to turn even flesh into machinery. He stared at it for a long time, remembering the German engineer, the burnt hangar, the runaway panjandrum, the cracked air cannon. So many dreams, all built to kill. We built gods of steel, Holt whispered to no one, and they demanded worship. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and steady, washing the city clean of its ghosts. But for Holt, and for anyone who remembered those strange weapons, the war would never truly be over. It lived on in blueprints and rust, in the stories whispered by machines that should never have existed. The storm outside grew heavier that night, and the sound of rain against glass took Holt back to 1945, to a different kind of storm. The one made by propellers and fear. The war had officially ended, but his work hadn't. Intelligence officers still searched Europe for whatever the Reich had hidden before collapsing. Vaults of gold, lost documents, and weapons so strange they seemed born from nightmares. When Holt arrived in Austria, the mountains were bruised by fog. The air smelled of damp stone and surrender. A convoy of Allied trucks rumbled along the narrow road, tires crunching over gravel. Their destination, an abandoned mining complex near Ebensee, rumored to be a storage site for a secret German experiment. Locals spoke of flickering lights at night, sounds like iron breathing, and soldiers who never came out once they went in. Inside the tunnels, the air was thick and stale. Holt followed the flicker of lanterns, the light catching on rusted rails and crates marked with black eagles. Then they found it, a strange, barrel-shaped object half buried under tarps and debris. It was small, no bigger than a motorcycle, but its nose was glass, and behind it, a cramped compartment barely large enough for one man. A faded Japanese symbol was painted near the tail. "Another kaiten," one of the officers said quietly. But this wasn't the sea. It was a mountain hundreds of miles from any coast. Holt knelt and brushed away dust from a metal plaque. Kleiner Hai, Little Shark. He opened his notebook. The thing was a hybrid, a German attempt to replicate and improve upon Japan's suicide torpedoes. Instead of a diver, it used a crude guidance system wired to a television camera. Early remote control. The operator could sit miles away and steer the torpedo by watching the live feed. War turned men into engineers of death, Holt murmured. And even when one madness ended, another began. They found test logs, scribbled in desperate handwriting. Each entry spoke of malfunctions, short circuits, and one successful detonation that destroyed the control station itself. Holt imagined the moment. A flicker on the screen, static, then white light. The Germans had built a weapon too smart for their own safety, a machine that killed its masters first. That night, as they left the mine, Holt felt the ground tremble faintly beneath his boots. The war had ended, but something deep beneath the earth still hummed, like a memory refusing to die. Weeks later, Holt was reassigned again, this time to the ruins of Hamburg, where British engineers were investigating another discovery. The city was a skeleton of iron beams and glass shards, But amid the rubble stood a warehouse intact enough to matter. Inside were the remains of aircraft unlike any he'd seen. Short, stubby wings, a bubble canopy, and rockets mounted under the fuselage. A weary scientist in a soot-streaked coat greeted him. "The Natter," the man said. "It means Viper." The Ba 349 Natter, a vertical takeoff rocket plane designed for one flight, one purpose, one pilot. It was meant to shoot up like a missile, fire its rockets at Allied bombers, then eject the pilot by parachute. In theory. In practice, it was suicide. The scientist's hands shook as he showed Holt a cracked photograph. A pilot climbing into a Natter, smiling nervously. "That was Lothar Sieber," he said softly. "The first man to fly it." It exploded seconds after launch. Pieces rained for miles. Holt looked at the broken fuselage, still bearing scorch marks from that test. The smell of burned metal hung faintly in the air. "All this brilliance," he whispered, "all this talent, just to find a faster way to die." The scientist nodded. "They believed they could frighten the sky itself. Holt stepped outside, watching evening light filter through drifting ash. Europe was free again, but its ghosts were restless. Everywhere he went, he found fragments of a dream that had eaten itself alive. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't seen everything. Somewhere out there, he was sure, another experiment had survived. Hidden, humming, waiting to be found. The next winter came slow and cold. Holt remained in uniform, though the world around him had stopped wearing its colors. The snow in Germany buried everything: bunkers, shells, and memories. When he got the telegram from Allied command, he thought it was a mistake. Proceed to Bavaria. Possible weapons cache located near the ruins of Castle Hohenfels. By then, most strange devices had been found, tagged, and studied. What could be left? Still, Holt went. He always went. Something in him needed to see how far men had gone, trying to destroy each other. The castle stood half-collapsed, its towers gnawed by fire. Local villagers avoided the place, calling it the mountain that screams. Holt's jeep stopped at the frozen moat. Two engineers met him at the gate, shivering in their heavy coats. "You'll want to see this," one said. Beneath the castle, through a narrow stone corridor, they reached a chamber that smelled of oil and dust. On the wall hung a shape like a cross between a cannon and a violin. Polished wood fused to metal tubes, wires running into a control box. A notebook lay open on a table, written in rushed German. The title translated roughly to Der Schallstrahler, the sound projector. The engineers explained, the Nazis had tried to create a sound weapon, a machine that could focus acoustic energy strong enough to kill at a distance. It wasn't fantasy. Experiments had proven sound waves could rupture organs, disorient troops, even ignite fuel vapors. The Germans had wanted to make it portable, to mount it on trucks and use it against advancing soldiers. One of the engineers flipped a switch on the control box. The machine hummed, low and hollow, like the growl of some invisible animal. The air trembled. Even that faint vibration made Holt's chest ache. "That's enough," he said quickly. They shut it off. Later, sitting by a lantern in the cold, Holt read through the German scientist's notes. Each entry grew more frantic. Early tests had worked. Rabbits killed instantly. Glass shattered. Men collapsing with bleeding ears. But the last pages were strange. "Frequency unstable," the scientist had written. "Device reacts to emotion. Fear amplifies output." It made no sense, but Holt could almost believe it. He'd seen fear do impossible things in war. The next morning, the soldiers prepared to move the device. As they lifted it, the old speaker cone cracked and released a deep vibration that made every man in the room stumble. One guard clutched his chest and gasped. Another dropped his rifle. Holt slammed his hand on the power switch, cutting the current. Silence. The only sound left was the engineer vomiting in the corner. They sealed the weapon in a steel crate and marked it for transport to London. Holt didn't speak the whole ride back. His ears rang for days afterward. Sometimes, when he tried to sleep, he swore he still heard that low hum under his heartbeat. In London, intelligence officers debriefed him, asked for details, and sent him home again. This time for good. But Holt couldn't let it go. He spent the next years quietly collecting fragments, blueprints, journals, old reports. Every strange weapon he'd found felt connected somehow, as if all those mad experiments had been searching for the same thing: control over nature itself. He thought about the wind guns, the bat bombs, the suicide torpedoes, the rocket planes, and now this, a machine that turned sound into death. Each had failed, yet each had nearly worked. Humanity had stood on the edge of making destruction itself invisible, and it terrified him. In 1949, long after uniforms had been hung away and medals forgotten, Holt returned once more to Germany on his own. The forests were quiet now, the rivers clear again. He found the ruins of Castle Hohenfels, snow melting on the stones. He walked down into the same chamber, now empty. Only the outline of the sound weapon remained on the wall. A pale ghost, where the wood had shielded the stone from smoke. He sat there for a long while, running his fingers over the cold surface. The silence felt heavy, almost alive. "I hope we learned," he whispered. But deep down, he knew they hadn't. Men forget too easily. Every age finds its new way to chase power, to build gods of steel, of fire, of air, of sound. He stood, brushed the dust from his coat, and walked back into the snow. Far above, in the brittle blue sky, a single airplane crossed the horizon, peaceful, steady, its contrail gleaming in the sun. Holt watched it fade and smiled sadly. The war was over, but its inventions still flew. The sea was calmer than he remembered. In the spring of 1950, Evan Holt stood at the rail of a ferry bound for Dover, the Channel air cold enough to sting his lungs. He hadn't crossed these waters since the war ended 5 years earlier, and the same gray horizon seemed to wait for him like a patient witness. The engines throbbed beneath his feet, steady, human, predictable, nothing like the shrieking contraptions he had chased through Europe. He closed his eyes and heard them anyway. The hiss of compressed air, the whine of rockets, the deep hum of that cursed sound cannon. Some noises never left a man. He had come back to England because someone from the War Office had written to him, asking for help cataloging a new exhibit at the Imperial Museum, Special Weapons Division, 1939-45. The letter was polite, official, and signed by a name he didn't recognize. For a week he'd ignored it, then packed a small bag and boarded the ferry without telling anyone why. Maybe he needed to see how history would explain what he'd seen. Maybe he hoped to find that it had all been exaggerated, that the world had moved on. London greeted him with drizzle and the smell of coal smoke. The museum stood unchanged. Tall columns, black iron gates, and a courtyard slick with rain. Inside, the curator, a young woman in a gray suit, met him at the door. "Mr. Holt, we're honored. I've read your field reports. You found quite a few of these curiosities yourself." He only nodded. His reports were dry things: measurements, locations, serial numbers. They didn't contain the memories. She led him through a series of dim halls until they reached the new wing. The lights were low, the air still. One by one, the machines of his past stood behind glass. The rusted frame of the vortex gun, the shell of the rocket plane, a section of the Panjandrum's wheel, the scorched cone of the sound projector. Each had a placard: date, purpose, result. Failure, failure, failure. He lingered before the Natter's broken fuselage. In the reflection of the glass, he saw himself beside the photograph of the pilot. Both faces thin, both eyes tired. "Did they ever find out why it exploded?" he asked quietly. "Structural instability, sir. Too much thrust, not enough guidance. The pilot had no chance." He nodded. He smiled for the picture anyway. The curator hesitated. "You sound almost sorry for him." "I am. They all thought they were saving something." She left him alone after that, sensing he wanted silence. He moved slowly from display to display, reading each line, letting the words settle. Visitors whispered around him, students, veterans, tourists, but they saw only relics. To him, they were voices. Every machine spoke its own language of desperation. When he reached the last case, he froze. Inside lay a small brass tuning fork on a wooden base, labeled Der Schallstrahler, frequency calibrator. It was the only piece recovered intact. Next to it sat a simple headset. A note beneath read, "Caution. Do not operate." He stared at it for a long time, remembering the vibration in his chest, the feeling of air turning solid. Then, very softly, he said, "You were never the monster." "We were." Outside, dusk gathered. He thanked the curator and stepped into the cold evening. The rain had stopped. The street lamps made halos on the wet pavement. He walked aimlessly through the city, past ration queues and children playing near rubble that still hadn't been cleared. The war was over, but its outline remained etched into every wall. At a small pub near the river, he ordered tea and sat by the window. The newspaper beside his table carried a headline, "New Jet Age Dawns, Faster Than Sound." He smiled faintly. Mankind had already turned speed itself into another weapon. When he finally returned to his rented room, he unpacked the one thing he always carried, a weathered notebook bound in green canvas. Inside were sketches of the devices he'd found, copied notes from captured files, and his own reflections scrawled in pencil. He turned to a blank page and began to write, "The war ended, but invention did not. Perhaps it never should. We build because we must. But there's a thin line between creation and cruelty. And in those years, we erased it." He paused, listening to the hum of traffic outside, then continued. "Every strange weapon I saw was a mirror. The vortex gun, our dream to command the wind. The bat bomb, our wish to make nature obey. The natter, our hunger to climb higher, faster, even when it killed us. The little shark, our fear of dying made into machinery. The sound projector, our own voice turned against us. We called them failures. I think they succeeded in showing us what we are." He set the pen down. The city clock struck 10. He poured a glass of water, stared at it a moment, and whispered, "Peace looks so fragile when it's quiet." Then he closed the notebook and placed it by the window, where the moonlight could touch its cover. In the weeks that followed, Holt stayed in London, working quietly with the museum staff. He helped translate German reports, identified unknown components, and told small stories that never made it into the exhibits. The frightened engineer who prayed over the vortex gun, the young British diver who laughed at the runaway Panjandrum, the Japanese mechanic who painted tiny cranes on every caton before sealing them. He told them not as facts, but as fragments of humanity inside the machinery. One morning, a school group toured the hall. A boy of about 10 stopped beside him and pointed to the vortex gun's shattered barrel. "Mister, did it work?" the child asked. Holt thought for a long moment before answering. "For a second," he said. And that was enough to scare everyone into stopping. The boy nodded, satisfied, and ran after his friends. Holt watched him go and felt something ease inside his chest. A small, unexpected peace. That night, as he left the museum, he noticed a thin crescent moon above the rooftops. He took a deep breath of the cold air. Somewhere far away, factories were already building new machines, sleek and silver, shaped for a different kind of war. But here, for now, the streets were calm. The only sound the steady rhythm of footsteps on wet stone. He decided that was enough. Years later, when his hair had gone white and his hands trembled too much to hold a pen, Evan Holt's notebook found its way into the museum's archives. A curator decades younger opened it and read the first page. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. These weapons were strange, yes, but not because they failed. They were strange because they showed us the edges of imagination. May we never cross them again. She closed the book, returned it to its drawer, and turned out the light. In the darkness, the faint hum of the city outside mingled with the silence of the relics. Somewhere among the glass cases, a drop of water from a leaky roof struck metal, echoing once, soft and clear, like the memory of a sound that had once shaken the air itself. And above it all, the night settled, a long exhale after years of holding its breath. The ghosts of invention, at last, grew quiet. The letter arrived in autumn. A plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from Berlin. Inside was a single sheet, typed in German, and signed with a name Evan hadn't seen since 1945. Dr. Anselm Kruger. Kruger had been one of the engineers they'd interrogated after the war, a man caught between genius and guilt. He'd designed parts of the sound projector, the weapon that had nearly torn the lungs out of a village outside Dresden. After the trials, Kruger disappeared, either fled to the east or was taken by the Americans. Now, 15 years later, he was asking to meet. "There is something left unfinished," the letter said. "Something we both deserve to understand." For days, Holt debated burning it. He had buried that part of his life, or so he'd thought. But curiosity is a kind of gravity, and history has its own pull. A week later, he boarded a train to Germany. The border guards checked his passport, glanced at the letter, and waved him through. The countryside blurred past the window. Fields stitched with fog. Forests that seemed to remember. As the train slowed near Dresden, the landscape turned gray and industrial. Smoke from new factories drifted above ruins that still hadn't healed. Kruger lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The man who opened the door looked nothing like the confident scientist Holt remembered. His face was thinner, his eyes nervous, his hands unsteady. "Herr Holt," he said softly, his accent worn thin by time. "You came." "I shouldn't have," Holt replied. "But you said something was unfinished." Kruger nodded and motioned for him to enter. The flat was dim, cluttered with papers, mechanical drawings, and glass tubes. In the corner stood something covered by a gray cloth. Tall, cylindrical, humming faintly. "I've spent years rebuilding it," Kruger said, gesturing toward the object. "The Schallstrahler. I needed to understand what went wrong. I thought perhaps, if it could be, repurposed." He trailed off, ashamed. "You built it again?" Holt's voice was sharp. "After everything it did?" Kruger met his gaze. "I built it smaller, controlled. It doesn't destroy, it listens." He pulled the cloth away. Beneath it stood a narrow column of polished metal, wires coiled like veins, and a circular diaphragm at the top. A tuning fork rested beside it. "It captures resonance," Kruger explained, almost pleading. "Every structure, every object has a frequency. Even memory does. I think sound leaves an imprint. Maybe we can hear the past." Holt stared, torn between disbelief and dread. "You mean ghosts?" Kruger gave a hollow laugh. "Physics, not ghosts. But perhaps they are the same thing." He flipped a switch. The device emitted a low hum, a heartbeat of vibration that filled the room. The air thickened. Dust trembled on the windowsill. Holt felt it in his chest. Not pain this time, but something close to recognition. Then came a faint sound beneath the hum. Distant voices, layered like echoes in water. German, English, shouts, prayers, orders. The past itself, tangled in static. Kruger turned a dial. The voices sharpened, resolving into a woman's scream, and then a single word. "Stop!" The machine flickered and went silent. Holt stood frozen. The room seemed smaller now, heavy with what had just passed through it. "That was from 1945, Kruger whispered. "The day it was tested. I think the air remembered." He shut the machine down and sat heavily in a chair. "Do you understand, Holt? We left something behind. The war, the noise, the fear. It doesn't fade. It vibrates still, perhaps forever." Holt looked at the trembling tuning fork. "You think we can listen to it? But what if we can't bear what it says?" Kruger smiled sadly. "Then we deserve the silence we built." They talked for hours about science, guilt, invention, about how both sides had fed the same hunger, to conquer nature, to outdo God. By midnight, Kruger's eyes were rimmed red. He confessed that the machine was his penance. "I wanted it to sing, not scream," he said. "If it could turn pain into harmony, maybe the world could forgive me." When Holt left at dawn, the fog over Dresden was pale blue. He walked until he reached the river, where the morning light struck the water in trembling bands. He stood there a long time, thinking about sound, invisible, unstoppable, and eternal. 2 days later, he received word that Kruger had died in his sleep. Heart failure, they said, but Holt suspected the truth. The man had finally turned off the machine inside his own chest. The authorities confiscated the device. They asked Holt for a statement, and he gave one, brief and honest. It was not a weapon anymore. It was a confession. Back in London, Holt returned to the museum. In the basement archives, he requested the key to the restricted collection. The curator, now older, raised an eyebrow. "More ghosts, Mr. Holt." "Just one," he said. "Just one," he said. He found the brass tuning fork exactly where he'd last seen it. He held it for a long time, then struck it gently against the edge of a cabinet. The pure note filled the room, soft, unwavering, and painfully human. For the first time, he didn't flinch from the sound. He took out his notebook and wrote his final entry. "War taught us to listen only for victory. But peace begins when we learn to listen to what's left behind." The strange weapons of that time were never truly silent. They whisper reminders. We just need the courage to hear them. He set the fork beside the notebook and walked toward the door. Outside, London streets were alive again, children laughing, buses rumbling, the world humming with new, ordinary noises. Holt paused, looked up at the gray sky, and smiled. In that moment, he realized something simple, yet profound. The strangest weapon mankind ever built wasn't steel or sound or flame. It was memory, the one invention that could not be disarmed. It was 1972 when the story resurfaced. The war had become history, printed, packaged, and quietly stored on library shelves. The world was chasing new fears now. Rockets that could touch the moon, bombs that could erase cities in silence. But in the basement of the Imperial Museum, dust still settled on the relics of an older madness. Clara Ames, a graduate researcher from Oxford, was cataloging obsolete acoustic technologies for her thesis. She was 27, bright, methodical, and utterly fascinated by sound. Her supervisor had given her a key and a warning. "Don't get lost down there, and if you find anything marked classified, close the box and walk away." She smiled, nodded, and went down anyway. The basement smelled of oil, paper, and time. Crates lined the walls, each stamped with fading dates: 1944, 1945, 1951. She opened one labeled Special Devices, recovered Germany, and found the brass tuning fork and a thin green notebook. The name on the inside cover stopped her. Evan Holt. The handwriting was precise. slanted, patient. She read a few lines, then more, until hours slipped by unnoticed. Every machine spoke its own language of desperation. Peace begins when we learn to listen to what's left behind. Clara was spellbound. She'd read technical reports from that era, but none written with such quiet sorrow. When she found the last page, the one where he described a device that could hear memory itself, she frowned. It sounded impossible, almost poetic, but at the bottom of the page, Holt had added a small sketch, a narrow column, a diaphragm, and a note. Rebuilt by A. Kruger, 1950, Dresden. May still exist. She dug through the rest of the crate and froze. Beneath a layer of cloth lay a metal cylinder, tarnished but intact. It looked exactly like the drawing. A tag dangled from its switch. Artifact 6-17A. Do not activate. Of course, she did. At first, nothing happened. The air was still, thick with dust. Then the machine hummed, a low, steady vibration that crawled up her spine. The fluorescent lights flickered. She adjusted a small dial, and the hum shifted into a pulse, like breathing. And then she heard it. Not words, not yet. Just echoes, distant footsteps, a door closing, the faint murmur of a man's voice. She leaned closer, heart racing. The sound grew sharper, layered with others. The whine of engines, a shout, a crash, a moment in time replaying itself, trapped inside the air. The machine stuttered, coughed static, and fell silent. Clara stood trembling. It had worked, at least for a moment. She looked again at Holt's notebook, her eyes catching a line she hadn't noticed before. Sound does not die. It only hides. She turned off the lights, locked the basement, and went home unable to sleep. All night, she kept hearing that echo, men shouting in two languages, the cry of, "Stop!" The next morning, she brought her professor, Dr. Mason, to the basement. He was older, cautious, more bureaucrat than scholar. She showed him the device, the notebook, the faint hum it still emitted even when unplugged. He frowned. "It's a relic, Miss Ames, nothing more. Those field notes, half confession, half imagination." Holt was one of the last men to believe that machines could feel guilt. "But it worked," she insisted. "I heard something, like a recording. A memory," Mason sighed. "There are no ghosts in metal, only the noise we bring with us." He ordered her to lock the device back in storage. She did, at least in front of him. That evening, when he'd gone home, she returned with a tape recorder. The hum greeted her like an old friend. She turned the dials slowly, careful not to push the fragile circuits too far. This time, the voices came quicker. German, English, fragments of fear. A young man crying, the sharp crack of machinery breaking. Then, unmistakably, a calm voice speaking English. If it could turn pain into harmony, maybe the world could forgive me. Clara's breath caught. That had to be Kruger, the German scientist Holt had written about. The voice continued, weaker now. "Tell Holt! It sings!" The tape snapped. The machine went dark. Clara sat in silence, heart pounding. The air around her felt heavy, vibrating faintly, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She rewound the tape, but the sound was gone. Only static remained. 2 days later, she found Holt's obituary. He'd died in 1961, quietly, in a small house by the sea. No family, no military honors. His personal effects had been donated to the museum, except the notebook, which had apparently vanished. Until now, she read every word again that night. In the margins of one page, Holt had written a small question. "If sound remembers, do we owe it the truth?" That line stayed with her. Over the next month, Clara transcribed every entry, every sketch. She recorded her experiments with the machine in careful detail, though she never told anyone at the museum what she was doing. It felt less like research and more like communion, an unspoken dialogue with two ghosts from another century. But something strange began to happen. The more she used the device, the more she noticed faint echoes even when it was turned off. Soft whispers in empty rooms, footsteps behind her when no one was there. The machine wasn't just remembering the past, it was teaching her to hear it everywhere. One evening, as she packed her notes, she caught her own reflection in the glass display case and, for an instant, thought she saw someone else. A tall man in an old coat, eyes calm, watching. The image vanished when she blinked, but she heard a faint sound. A tuning fork's single, perfect note. After that, she stopped using the device. She wrote her thesis on wartime acoustics, leaving out the strange experiment, and moved on to a new project in radio preservation. But before she left the museum, she made one final entry in Holt's notebook, beneath his last words. "Your echoes still speak." "We hear them, Mr. Holt. We're still listening." She returned the book to its crate and locked it. The key she kept on a small chain around her neck for the rest of her life. 50 years later, long after Clara Ames was gone, the museum prepared for renovation. A young archivist named Jordan Reese was assigned to digitize the Acoustic Curiosities collection. He found the crate, opened it, and smiled. Inside, the tuning fork still gleamed faintly, untouched by time. The notebook was brittle but legible, and beneath them, half buried in cloth, was the cylinder, quiet, waiting. When he lifted it, he felt a faint tremor run through the floor. He checked the catalog. Artifact 6 to 17A, unclassified, possibly experimental audio recorder. He switched it on. The hum returned instantly, clean and deep. His laptop microphone picked it up, translating it into a visible waveform, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Then the waveform shifted, rising and falling as if the machine itself were breathing. Jordan leaned closer. At first only static, then a man's voice. "War taught us to listen only for victory." He froze. The words were soft but clear, and he recognized the name in the metadata tag, E. Holt, 1955, recording. But there were no known tapes from that year. But peace begins when we learn to listen to what's left behind. When we learn to listen to what's left behind. The voice faded. The waveform flattened. The room was silent again. He checked his headphones. No input source. No playback file. The machine wasn't connected to anything at all. On impulse, he struck the tuning fork beside it. The sound rang out, pure and unwavering, and for a brief moment, the waveform jumped, forming the shape of a human heartbeat. Then both sounds faded into stillness. Jordan saved the data, labeled it Residual Echo, Project Holt. He shut off the lights and left the basement, the hum still lingering in his ears. Later that night, reviewing the recording on his laptop, he noticed something odd. In the final second, barely audible beneath Holt's voice, another whisper appeared. A woman's this time, soft and certain. "We're still listening." He replayed it again and again, the sound faint but real. Two lives, decades apart, speaking across time through a machine built for war but reborn in peace. He didn't report it. Some things belong to silence. And so the strange weapon's story ended. Not with destruction, but with remembrance. The machine that once turned sound into pain had become something else entirely. A vessel of memory. It held within it the voices of those who built, those who suffered, and those who tried to understand. In the museum's darkened hall, long after closing, the air still carried a faint vibration, like the aftershock of a note that refused to die. Visitors walking past might not hear it, but if you stood very still and listened carefully, you could almost make out the whisper. The past is never silent. The museum had changed. By 2045, it was no longer called the Imperial Museum of War. It was simply the Memory Archive. The exhibits were no longer glass cases and plaques, but immersive holographic spaces, rooms where visitors could walk through reconstructed history, where the past breathed again through sound and light. And deep below the main floors, behind biometric locks and soundproof walls, the old storage wing still existed. The curators rarely went there anymore. Its catalog was fully digitized, its contents forgotten, but the air remained the same, cool, heavy, waiting. That was where the technician found it. Her name was Mira Holt. She was a data engineer, 29 years old, second generation of immigrants who had never known war. Her surname was common enough that she never thought much of it, until the day she stumbled upon a restricted digital file labeled Project Holt, Residual Echo. Curiosity drew her in. The file contained fragments, audio logs, old scans of handwritten notes, and a decades-old report from a researcher named Clara Ames. The attached metadata read, Artifact 6-17A, unknown acoustic device, possible post-war experimental recorder, contains anomalous resonance, origin unclear. There was also a faded photograph, an elderly man beside a cylindrical machine, his hand resting on a brass tuning fork. The caption read simply, Evan Holt, 1950. The name struck her like a spark. She searched deeper into the archives, tracing records through generations of curators. The more she found, the stranger it became. Letters from 1945, personal field reports, even mention of a German engineer named Dr. Anselm Kruger. Each document circled the same mystery. A weapon that could capture sound so completely that it preserved echoes of the past. Mira wasn't supposed to reactivate classified artifacts, but rules are only as strong as curiosity. That night, when the museum was empty, she used her clearance to enter the lower vault. The air smelled of iron and old paper. Lights hummed softly as she passed through rows of crates and display remnants. Finally, she found it. The same crate, the same label, the same brass fork resting atop the metal cylinder. The tag still said, Do not activate. She smiled faintly. People always say that right before history happens. When she powered the device, the low hum filled the chamber instantly. Ancient, steady, almost human. But this time it reacted differently. The sensors in her wristband flickered. The air temperature dropped a few degrees. Her earpiece crackled, syncing automatically to the machine's vibration. A voice emerged. If it could turn pain into harmony, Mira froze. Wait, what? The voice was old, calm, faint. Then another voice followed. Female, younger. We're still listening. She looked around. The room was empty. The waveform on her tablet pulsed again, then began to form something new, a rhythm, a heartbeat. A faint, harmonic progression, like music trying to remember itself. She sat down on the floor, back against the crate, eyes wide. It's not just playback, she whispered. It's alive. Over the next weeks, she worked in secret. Every time she powered it, the machine responded differently. Sometimes with static, sometimes with faint traces of voices that didn't match any recording in the database. Once she heard children laughing. Another time, a soft cry in German. She began recording everything. She noticed the sounds weren't random. They came in sequences, patterns, almost conversations. And then, one night, she heard her own name. Mira. She froze. Who's there? No response. Just a low pulse through the floor, like a heartbeat beneath stone. She replayed the recording. Her name was unmistakable, spoken in a man's voice. She checked the old archives again. Among the scanned pages of Holt's notebook, she found something she'd missed before. A final paragraph written in shaky handwriting. If sound carries memory, then perhaps memory carries us. To whoever finds this, we are all echoes waiting to be heard. Her chest tightened. The handwriting was signed E.H. She stared at it for a long time, then looked again at the brass tuning fork beside the device. For a reason she couldn't explain, she picked it up and struck it gently. The note rang pure and steady, and in that instant, the machine answered. The lights flickered, the hum grew deeper, and then, like a tide returning, the room filled with voices. Not chaotic, but layered in harmony. Men and women speaking softly in dozens of languages. Laughter, a baby's cry, the crackle of radio static, the faint melody of a wartime song she didn't know. Tears filled her eyes. It wasn't noise, it was memory, humanity itself, woven into the air. In the heart of the sound, one voice rose above the rest. A man's, calm, distant, but unmistakably clear. We dreamed of conquering the world with sound. Instead, we left it full of ghosts. But maybe that's all history ever was. Voices calling out to be remembered. The machine began to dim, the hum fading to silence. Mira stood motionless for a long time, letting the quiet return. When she left that night, she made one final entry in the digital record. Her log read simply, Artifact 617A. Not a weapon, not a machine, a memory. Recommend preservation without interference. She closed the file, logged off the terminal, and turned out the lights. But as she walked away, a faint vibration followed her. A whisper through the concrete walls, softer than breath, saying her name one last time. Months passed. The museum reopened with new exhibits. The old acoustic device remained sealed in the lower archives, its location quietly removed from the digital index. Mira transferred to a different project. Climate data analysis, nothing to do with war or sound. But she carried the tuning fork with her, tucked safely into her bag. Sometimes, late at night, she would strike it lightly and listen to the note fade. And just before it vanished, she would swear she could hear faint voices beneath it, distant, patient, eternal. Her colleagues teased her about her fascination with haunted frequencies. She never argued. Some truths don't need defending. One evening, after everyone had gone home, she sat alone in her apartment, the fork resting on her desk beside a cup of tea. She thought about the people she'd never met. Kruger, Clara, Evan Holt. Their lives stretched across a century, connected by one impossible machine and a single human instinct: to be heard. She opened her laptop and began to type. We think of history as something finished, but it isn't. It breathes in the walls. It hums through the air. The past never leaves us. It just waits until someone is willing to listen. She saved the document under the name The Sound Remains. Outside, a storm rolled over London. Thunder echoed through the city, and for a brief moment, one could almost believe the sky itself was remembering. Years later, when Mira Holt's recordings were rediscovered, they became part of a virtual exhibit called Echoes of War. Visitors could step into a digital space and hear fragments of real voices captured across generations. Among the files, one stood out, a track labeled Final Note. It was short. 30 seconds, a soft hum, followed by a single pure tone. Then, just before the end, a man's voice whispered, "Listen carefully. Every silence hides a story." And beneath that, faintly, a young woman's voice answered, "We're still listening." Voice answered, "We're still listening." Then nothing. The screen faded to black. But if you stood quietly in that exhibit, long after the recording ended, you could still feel it, a faint vibration underfoot, a low resonance that never completely stopped, a heartbeat made of sound, a war that never truly ended, because it had become something else. A reminder that every invention, no matter how strange or terrible, carries within it the same simple truth: humanity's desperate wish not to be forgotten. And so, deep in the lowest vault of the memory archive, the old device still rests in the dark, its metal body cold but not dead. Sometimes, when the air shifts, it hums softly to itself, an echo looping endlessly, carrying the same words through time. Peace begins when we learn to listen to what's left behind. The museum was quiet again. Outside, the city had grown taller, brighter, faster. Cars no longer burned fuel, and the sky above London glowed with the soft pulse of distant satellites. But deep underground, in the same chamber where the strange weapon had once hummed, time itself felt suspended. The walls had been reinforced, the crates sealed and catalogued into the global memory database. Technicians rarely came down anymore. Machines did the maintenance now, silent drones gliding between aisles, scanning, cleaning, recording. One of them paused before a section labeled Obsolete Technologies, 20th Century Acoustic Research. Its optical sensor flickered, scanning the old device inside the glass. Artifact 617A. Status: contained. Condition: stable. Activity: residual. The drone hesitated, then moved on. Moments later, the faint hum began again. It was so soft, so low, that the sensors didn't register it. But if a human ear had been there, one capable of listening beyond ordinary sound, it might have heard something beneath the vibration. Not words exactly, just the trace of breath, the rhythm of thought, the voice of the past, remembering itself. Far above, in the main hall of the Memory Archive, a group of students gathered around a holographic display titled Echoes of War. Their teacher, an older woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, adjusted the controls, and a sphere of light appeared before them, shimmering with floating images of old battlefields, factories and faces. This project, she said softly, was built from recordings found more than a century ago. Voices of engineers, soldiers, nurses, and ordinary people, captured in fragments of sound that somehow survived. A student raised his hand. But how can sound survive that long? The teacher smiled. It doesn't, not exactly. The air forgets, but the world remembers. Vibrations leave imprints. These machines, the ones people feared, accidentally preserved them. Every echo is a kind of photograph of time. She pressed a button. A low hum filled the room. The air shimmered, and a man's voice, steady, measured, emerged from the speakers. We dreamed of conquering the world with sound. Instead, we left it full of ghosts. The teacher paused the playback. That was Evan Holt, she said, an investigator who documented experimental weapons in the 1940s. His notes survived in fragments. We reconstructed his voice from analog patterns found inside an old device. Another student whispered, "He sounds sad." He was, the teacher replied, but not hopeless. She touched another control. The hologram shifted, showing a young woman from the 1970s, seated beside the same machine, wearing large headphones. "We're still listening," said the woman's voice. That was Clara Ames, the teacher explained. She rediscovered Holt's work decades later. She believed the machine didn't just record sound, it remembered emotion. That belief guided her entire career. Then came a third voice, clear and modern, speaking gently over the hum. We think of history as something finished, but it isn't. It breathes in the walls. It hums through the air. The past never leaves us. It just waits until someone is willing to listen. The students glanced up at the teacher, recognizing the voice. She smiled faintly. That last one was my grandmother, Mira Holt. The class grew quiet. She continued. She never talked much about it. But when I was a child, she told me once that our family wasn't known for what we built, but for what we remembered. The projection faded to darkness, leaving only the faint hum of silence, the kind that feels almost alive. Every sound, the teacher said softly, is a story waiting to be heard. and every silence hides what we're afraid to remember. After the class left, she lingered in the empty hall, looking at the display one last time. The hologram's title floated gently in the air. The Strange Weapons of World War II. Subheading: From Destruction to Memory, she whispered to herself. You'd like this, grandfather. For a moment, she could almost hear a reply, a warm, familiar tone behind her carried by the air. Just a single word. Listen. She closed her eyes. The sound faded, but the warmth remained. That night, after the museum closed, she walked to the lower levels. Security was automated now. Her access clearance opened every door without question. The air down there smelled faintly of metal and dust. The lights buzzed softly overhead. When she reached the chamber, she stood before the sealed case. Inside rested the same old cylinder, the same tuning fork beside it. She placed her hand on the glass. The machine hummed faintly beneath her fingertips. "Hello again," she whispered. "I think it's time you spoke one more time." She unlocked the seal. The hiss of air sounded almost like a sigh. The moment she powered the device, the hum rose, not harsh, not angry, but steady and resonant. The lights dimmed slightly. Her heart began to race, but she didn't step back. "Evan Holt," she said aloud. "Clara Ames, Mira Holt, all of you. I'm here. You can speak now." The machine pulsed once, then again. And then, sound, soft at first, then clearer. "We hear you." It wasn't one voice, but many. Layers upon layers, male and female, young and old, speaking together in harmony. She felt tears in her eyes. "What are you?" "Memory," the chorus replied. "The sound that remains when everything else is gone." The room filled with light. Not blinding, but warm, like morning through fog. Images formed in the air. A factory line, a woman in uniform, a pilot smiling before takeoff, a man writing by candlelight. They flickered, merged, and faded again. "Are you alive?" she whispered. "We are what was left behind. We are what you chose to remember." The hum deepened, the resonance wrapping around her like a heartbeat. She stepped closer, tears streaming freely now. "I don't want to forget you." "You won't. None of you ever will. That is both the gift and the curse of sound. It never truly dies." Then, as the light began to fade, one final voice broke through the others. A man's, calm and steady. "Peace begins when we learn to listen to what's left behind." The hum stopped. The lights brightened. The room was still. She stood motionless for a long time, the silence pressing gently around her. Then she smiled, wiped her eyes, and whispered, "Good night, all of you." She resealed the case, deactivated the lights, and walked away. As she reached the elevator, the sensors in the room behind her flickered briefly. Inside the sealed case, the tuning fork gave a single perfect note. Clear, resonant, eternal. The museum logs recorded it as acoustic feedback event. No one ever heard it again. But if you visit the memory archive today and stand very still in the quiet hall where the old relics rest, you might catch it. The faint hum, the whisper of 1,000 stories waiting just beyond silence. And if you listen closely enough, if you truly listen, you'll hear them, all of them, still speaking, still remembering, still alive. Fade out, soft orchestral music rises. Low strings, faint piano, a melody that feels like breath returning. Voiceover, quiet and steady. In war, sound was a weapon. In peace, it became memory. And in the echoes we leave behind, we remain. Echoes we leave behind, we remain.